Poirot. Before a single episode was filmed, the man who played him spent his afternoons walking round his own garden with a penny clenched between his buttocks. His name is David Suchet. He was 42 years old, and he was entirely serious. Agatha Christie had written that her detective moved in small, rapid, mincing steps, and Suchet had decided that if he could not walk the way the man walked on the page, he had no business playing him at all. That garden was 37 years ago. Today you are going to find out what became of him and of the 5 people who stood closest to him. Start with the little man himself, because he is the reason you clicked. David Suchet was born in London on the 2nd of May 1946 into a household where nobody acted. His father, Jack Suchet, was a gynecologist. His mother's father, James Jarchet, was a Fleet Street photographer and one of the finest there has ever been. Jarchet took the first pictures of Edward VIII with Wallis Simpson. He photographed Louis Blériot in 1909 after the man had flown across the English Channel. He was there at the siege of Sydney Street. So the family talent was not for performing, it was for looking very hard at people and catching the thing everybody else had missed. Hold on to that, because his grandson would build an entire career out of exactly the same instinct. Suchet joined the National Youth Theatre at 16, then trained at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. What followed was 20 years of serious, unglamorous, properly respected work, and almost none of it was on television. He was a Royal Shakespeare Company actor. He played Iago in Othello, Caliban in The Tempest, Tybalt in Romeo and Juliet, and the title role in Timon of Athens. If you had asked a theatre critic in 1985 who David Suchet was, you would have been told he was one of the best character actors in the country and probably too good to ever be famous. Television did know him, though, and here is the first thing that surprises people. In 1985, he played Blot in the BBC's adaptation of Tom Sharp's Blot on the Landscape, a gardener with a shotgun and a complete disregard for the law opposite George Cole. Watch 2 minutes of it, and then watch 2 minutes of Poirot. It is not the same actor. It is not even the same species of actor. That is the whole point of him. And then, in 1988, London Weekend Television offered him a Belgian detective in a bowler hat, and Suchet did something that almost nobody does with a television job. He went and read the books. All of them. Every Poirot story Agatha Christie ever wrote, from the very first to the last, and as he read, he kept a notebook open beside him. Every time Christie mentioned something about the man, how he took his coffee, how he felt about the English, what he did with his hands when he was thinking, which way he turned his moustaches, he wrote it down. By the time he had finished, that notebook held 93 separate characteristics. 93. For a part most actors would have prepared for by watching whoever had played it last. And the notebook was not decoration. It is why the performance holds up over 70 stories, because it gave him something to obey. When a script asked Poirot to do something the notebook said he would not do, Suchet argued about it, and more often than not, he won. That is a difficult way to make television, and it makes an enormous difference on screen. The man you are watching has rules. He is not being improvised at you week to week. The straightening of an ornament on somebody else's mantelpiece, the horror of a boiled egg that does not match its neighbour, the small vanity about the moustaches. None of that is an actor being funny. It is a man behaving consistently for 24 years, according to a list he wrote before he started. He refused to do that too, by the way. He would not watch another man's Poirot, not one of them, because he did not want somebody else's choices leaking into his own. He built the whole thing from the page upwards, and The Penny in the Garden was simply the final piece of it. Christie says the walk is quick and mincing, so Suchet found the one method that would force his knees together and shorten his stride, and he practiced in the open air until it stopped being a trick and became the way he moved. You can see the result inside the first 30 seconds of any episode. It is not an impression of a fussy foreigner. It is a man whose body has genuinely been retrained, and they built the world around him with the same fussiness, which is a large part of why the programme still looks so good. That white curved apartment block you picture the moment somebody says the word Poirot is a real building. It is called Florin Court, and it stands on the eastern side of Charterhouse Square in Smithfield in London, and you can walk past it this afternoon if you want to. The production went looking for something that would say Art Deco the instant it appeared on screen, and there were very few blocks in the whole of London that could do it. Florin Court could. It became Whitehaven Mansions from the very first series in 1989. and it stayed his address for 24 years. The inside was never real, mind you. The flat itself was a set at Pinewood Studios. So the door he walks through and the room he walks into are about 18 miles apart, and you have never once noticed. Something else happened around that time, and it matters more to his story than the acting does. At the age of 40, David Suchet became a Christian. That is 3 years before the first episode of Poirot was shot, and he has spoken about it plainly ever since, without ever once making it anybody else's business. Remember it, because 30 years later it produces the strangest entry on his whole CV, and I will come back to it. He played Poirot from 1989 to 2013. Not for a series, not for a decade, for 24 years across more than 70 stories. And here is the fact that still astonishes people who know the books. He finished them. Every single Poirot case Agatha Christie ever put on paper, David Suchet performed. Nobody else has done it. Nobody else has come close. Think about what that actually means for a working actor. There are men and women who spend 40 years hoping for one part the public will remember. Suchet got one, and then had to live inside it for a quarter of a century, watching his own face change in the mirror while the man he was playing never aged a day. So what do you do with the rest of your life after that? That is the question sitting underneath this whole video, and it applies to every one of the 6 people you are going to meet. I will keep coming back to it. Suchet never actually stopped doing the other work, which is why the answer for him was easier than it might have been. In 2001, he played Augustus Melmotta in The Way We Live Now, a swindling financier out of Anthony Trollope, and it won him awards from the Royal Television Society and the Broadcasting Press Guild. Plenty of people who have never watched a minute of Poirot will tell you that is his best performance. On stage, he played George in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1996, and then in 1998 he played Salieri in Amadeus, the man who has to stand next to genius every day and understand exactly what he is looking at and know he will never have it. That performance was nominated for both an Olivier and a Tony. And then there is the thing he had wanted to do since the day he was converted. Between filming the final Poirot episodes, David Suchet went into a recording studio and read the Bible. Not passages of it, all of it, cover to cover, more than 200 hours of studio time, the first complete audio new international version recorded by a single British actor. He came off a murder set and went to read Leviticus, then went back to the murder set. In the 2011 New Year Honours, he was made a Commander of the Order of the British Empire. And in 2020, the country went considerably further. David Suchet was knighted in the Queen's Birthday Honours for services to drama and to charity. 50 years of work, 93 notes in a notebook, and a penny in a suburban garden. And the man walks out as Sir David Suchet. He is 80 now, and he has not stopped. He tours theatres with an evening of readings and stories, standing on a bare stage talking to a room full of people about a life spent acting, and the halls sell out. What he leaves behind is not a catchphrase or a costume. It is a piece of proof that if you take a popular part seriously enough, you can make it into something that outlasts everybody who sneered at it. The next one spent the early 1970s in a folk rock band, and he co-wrote a piece of music you have almost certainly sung along to as a child without ever knowing whose it was. Second in our 6, and there is no argument about who it has to be, Captain Arthur Hastings. Hugh Fraser was born on the 23rd of October 1945, and if Poirot was the brain of those episodes, then Hastings was the reason the brain had anybody to talk to. This is a far harder job than it looks. Hastings has to be decent and a little slow and entirely without vanity, and he has to be all of that without ever tipping over into a joke, because the second you start laughing at him rather than with him, the whole friendship falls apart and the detective starts to look cruel. Fraser held that line through 8 series, then came back for the final one, and he never once let Hastings be foolish. He simply let him be kind. Now, the music. In the early 1970s, long before any of this, Fraser was a member of a folk rock group called Telltale, and while he was with them, he co-wrote the theme tune to Rainbow, the children's program that started on ITV in 1972. If you grew up anywhere in Britain in the 70s or the 80s, that tune is playing in your head right now whether you asked for it or not. Captain Hastings wrote it. His screen work either side of Poirot is much broader than most people realise. He was in Peter Greenaway's The Draftsman's Contract. He was in Firefox, directed by Clint Eastwood. He turned up in Patriot Games and in 101 Dalmatians. On stage he did Teeth and Smiles at the Royal Court and then in the West End at Wyndham's, and the Royal Shakespeare Company gave him several parts over the years. For a long stretch he was also the Duke of Wellington in Sharp, taking the role over from David Troughton, which makes for an odd sort of double life. The amiable, slightly bewildered Hastings on one channel and the coldest commander in British military history on the other. And then something happened to Hastings that I suspect you noticed at the time without ever being told why. After the 8th series he vanished. So did Chief Inspector Japp. So did Miss Lemon. 3 of the 4 faces you had watched for more than a decade simply stopped appearing, and the programme carried on without them, and Poirot got quieter and colder and rather more alone. Series 9, 10, 11 and 12 went out with none of the 3 of them in it. If you have ever felt that the later Poirots have a different weather to the early ones, that is exactly why. The detective had lost his friends. That was a deliberate decision about the tone of the show rather than anything to do with the actors, and the writing in those years is often very fine. But it does something strange to you as a viewer. You spend 4 series waiting for a door to open and the wrong person keeps coming through it. And then, for the 13th and final series, they brought all 3 of them back. Fraser returned for Curtain, which is the story in which Poirot dies and which Agatha Christie had written decades before she allowed anybody to publish it. Hastings is at his friend's side at the end of it. So the last thing that ever happens in 24 years of this programme is that the 2 of them are in a room together again, and Hugh Fraser had to play it. He has spoken since about how strange it was saying goodbye to a part he had lived with for a quarter of a century, and you can hear it in the performance if you know to listen for it. But the real surprise in Hugh Fraser's story is what he did once Poirot finished, because he did not retire and he did not coast on it. He became a novelist. 4 books so far in a series about a woman called Rena Walker. Harm, then Threat, then Malice, then Stealth. And Rena Walker is a contract killer working in London in the 1960s. They are hard, violent, unsentimental thrillers. They are about as far from a body in the library as it is possible to travel. And they were written by the man who spent 24 years being the most decent person in every room he walked into. He is also, without most people knowing it, one of the most heard voices in crime fiction. Fraser narrates Agatha Christie's novels as audiobooks, dozens of separate characters in each one, published by HarperCollins and carried on Audible. If you have ever fallen asleep to a Christie audiobook, there is a very good chance it was Hastings reading it to you. And he teaches. In recent years, he has been an associate tutor and director at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, sitting on the audition panel, specialising in Shakespeare. So a nervous 19-year-old walking into that room to be judged is, in part, being judged by Captain Hastings. At 80, Hugh Fraser has ended up with the career people always say they want and almost nobody builds. He acted, then he wrote, then he taught, and each one fed the next. What he leaves behind is the quieter half of the most famous friendship in detective fiction, and a reminder that the person standing slightly to one side of the star is very often the one holding the scene up. The third face belongs to a man who was nominated for a major American award, and it had nothing whatever to do with Agatha Christie. Chief Inspector Japp comes next, and Philip Jackson is the reason those episodes have any weather in them at all. He was born on the 18th of June 1948 in Retford in Nottinghamshire, which is worth saying out loud because Japp is such a thoroughly London character that most people assume the actor must be a Londoner too. He is not, and he did not come up the usual way either. Jackson started acting while he was at the University of Bristol, where the subject he was actually reading was drama and German. Keep hold of the German for a moment. It tells you something about the kind of young man he was. Somebody drawn to exact, difficult, unforgiving things, which is precisely the quality he later poured into a Scotland Yard inspector who checks everything twice. After university came years of repertory theatre, learning the job in front of audiences who had paid for their seats and were not inclined to be generous about it. What he does with Japp is very clever and almost invisible. Poirot needs somebody to be wrong in front of, but if the policeman is stupid, then the detective becomes a bully and you stop liking him. So Jackson plays Japp as a perfectly competent copper doing an ordinary job at ordinary speed, standing next to a man who is not ordinary at all. He is never humiliated, he is simply outrun. That single choice is the reason the two of them are still funny together after 9 series. He played Japp through the first 8 and then came back for the 13th and last, which is its own kind of statement about how those people felt about each other. Here is the part that surprises everybody. In 1998, Philip Jackson appeared in Little Voice playing George, and the cast of that film was nominated for a Screen Actors Guild Award. That is the American film industry's own prize, voted for by actors, and Japp is on the list. He was in Brassed Off. He was in My Week with Marilyn. And if you were a certain age in the middle of the 1980s, you knew his face long before Poirot, because he was Abbot Hugo, the scheming churchman in Robin of Sherwood, and there are people who will argue to this day that it is still the best thing he has ever done. On stage, he has gone after the heavyweight parts and got them. He played Pozzo in Waiting for Godot at the Queen's Theatre in the West End in 1991. He played Willy Loman in Death of a Salesman at the West Yorkshire Playhouse in Leeds in 2010. And Willy Loman is the part every serious actor of a certain age wants, and most of them never get within a mile of. He has also kept working properly, not decoratively, into his late 70s. He appeared in the BBC crime drama Sherwood playing Mickey Sparrow between 2022 and 2024. That series is set in the Nottinghamshire coalfields, which is to say, he went home to do it. Retford is a few miles up the road from where the story takes place. Philip Jackson turned 78 in June, and what he leaves behind is a lesson in generosity. He spent 9 series making somebody else look brilliant, and he was quietly one of the finest character actors in the country the whole time he was doing it. The next one walked out in front of a screaming crowd more than 20 years before she ever answered Poirot's telephone, and she was not acting. Fourth, and my own favourite story in this video, Miss Felicity Lemon. Pauline Moran was born on the 26th of August, 1947 in Blackpool. She trained at the National Youth Theatre and then at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, which is precisely the background you would guess for the woman who plays the most formidably efficient secretary in British television. Except that in between, from 1965 until around 1970, Pauline Moran played bass guitar in an all-female band called the She Trinity. Sit with that for a second. Miss Lemon, the filing system, the purse disapproval, the woman who could locate any document in England inside 9 seconds, spent the back half of the 1960s with a bass slung across her in a working band, in the years when a woman playing bass in Britain was rare enough to be worth writing about. She was in her late teens and her early 20s. She was there for all of it, and she is so good in Poirot precisely because she never plays Miss Lemon as a joke. Watch her in a scene where she has a single line and no close-up. She is still working, filing, listening, disapproving of somebody by about 2 millimeters of eyebrow. It is the sort of performance that only announces itself when you go back and watch it a second time, which, if you have got this far into the video, you very probably have. And think about what that band means for the way she plays the part. A woman who has stood on a stage with an amplifier behind her knows exactly how much noise a room can take. That is why Miss Lemon never raises her voice. She doesn't need to. She has been louder than any of them already 20 years earlier and got it out of her system. She was there for the first 3 series, then 5 through 8. She is missing from the 4th. And then she went with the others in that long gap and came back for the 13th at the end. Her return is a small thing on paper, and it lands surprisingly hard. An older Miss Lemon in an older Poirot's flat with a great deal of water under both of them. Away from that office, she has done a great deal more than she is given credit for. She was in The Good Soldier in 1981. She was in The Woman in Black in 1989, the original television version, the one that frightened a whole generation and is still argued about by people who saw it once and never forgot it. She was in the television series The Cleopatras. Much later, she turned up in A Little Chaos, the Versailles film, in 2014, and she has always been principally a stage actress, which means the screen has only ever had a portion of her. Then there is the other life. Since 1987, Pauline Moran has worked as a professional astrologer, not as a hobby, professionally for the best part of 40 years, alongside the acting. Whatever you make of that, and people make all sorts of things of it, there is something rather lovely in the fact that the woman who gave us the most rigorously organised character on British television spends her working hours on a system that could not be less like a filing cabinet. Which brings me to something I would genuinely like to ask you. What is the one small thing you remember most about watching these episodes? The music at the start? The shape of that flat? The particular way a Sunday evening felt when Poirot was on the television? Put it in the comments. I read them, and the answers underneath these videos are always better than anything I could write. Pauline Moran turns 79 later this month. What she leaves behind is the reminder that the quietest person on the call sheet has almost always had the most interesting life. The next one was born 4,000 miles from here, and the reason her family ever came to Britain is one of the harder stories in this video. Before we get to her, hold that question in your head again because it changes shape from here on. What do you do with the rest of your life after a part like this? For the 4 people you have met so far, the answer came after Poirot. For the last 2, it came before. They arrived at the series in their late 50s with entire careers already behind them, and they were joining something that had been running since 1989. Imagine walking onto a set where everybody has known each other for 17 years. 5th, and the woman who walked into the series 17 years after it began and made the whole thing feel new, Ariadne Oliver. Zoë Wanamaker was born on the 13th of May 1949 in New York City. Her mother, Charlotte Holland, was a Canadian actress and radio performer. Her father was Sam Wanamaker, and Sam Wanamaker's life explains almost everything about his daughters. He was an American actor and director, and in 1952 he was blacklisted. That is the flat, bureaucratic word for what was done to a great many talented Americans in those years. And what it meant in practice was that his own country had decided he was not allowed to work in it. So he did not go home. He stayed in Britain, and he brought his family across. And Zoe grew up in London as an American child in an English city, because of a decision taken about her father by people who had never met him. What he did with the rest of his life is genuinely extraordinary. Sam Wanamaker looked at the fact that London, the city Shakespeare actually worked in, had no Globe Theatre, and he spent decades fighting to put one back on the South Bank. He was mocked for it for years. He raised the money anyway. He died in London on the 18th of December 1993 of lung cancer at 74, and he did not live to see the theatre open. It stands there today because a blacklisted American refused to let it go. The indoor playhouse alongside it, which opened in January 2014, carries his name. His daughter became one of the finest stage actresses in this country, and the record is not close. She was a member of the Royal Shakespeare Company from 1976 to 1984. She has been nominated for 9 Olivier Awards and won Best Actress twice for Electra and for Once in a Lifetime. She has 4 Tony Award nominations to her name, for Piaf, for Lute, for Electra, and for Awake and Sing. She has done The Cherry Orchard, Much Ado About Nothing and The Rose Tattoo at the National Theatre, Passion Play at the Duke of York's, All My Sons at the Apollo. That is a theatre career of the very top rank, built first with the television coming afterwards, which is the opposite way round from how most famous faces are made. You know her from more places than you think. She was Susan Harper in My Family for 11 years, going toe-to-toe with Robert Lindsay every week in front of enormous audiences. She was Madame Hooch in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, The Whistle, The Broomsticks, The Flying Lesson, and for a whole generation of children that was the first time they ever laid eyes on her. And then here is the fact that stops people cold. Zoë Wanamaker did not become a British citizen until the year 2000. She had lived here since she was a small child. 48 years. What finally prompted it was being told she was to be appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 2001 New Year Honours, and she went to Buckingham Palace to collect it from the Queen. A father shut out of one country, a daughter honoured by another. When she joined Poirot in Series 10 in 2006 as the crime novelist Ariadne Oliver, she changed the temperature of the programme. Ariadne is Agatha Christie's own joke about herself. A successful mystery writer, permanently exasperated by the detective she invented, eating apples and saying precisely the wrong thing at precisely the wrong moment. Wanamaker plays her as somebody who genuinely likes Poirot and is genuinely infuriated by him, often inside the same sentence, and after 17 years of a very controlled series that felt like somebody opening a window. There is one more thing about her worth saying, and it goes back to her father. Sam Wanamaker spent the last stretch of his life being told that rebuilding a Shakespearean theatre on the South Bank was a sentimental impossibility. He kept going anyway through the objections and the fundraising and the years when it looked ridiculous. His daughter has spent her own career doing the thing he was fighting to make a home for: Shakespeare on a stage in front of people. 9 Olivier nominations and 2 wins is not a coincidence. It is a family carrying on a piece of unfinished business. And if you ever stand in that indoor playhouse with his name over the door, that is what you are standing inside. She is 77, still working, and still one of the actors that other actors buy a ticket to go and watch. If you are enjoying this and you would like more of them, do think about subscribing. There is one person still to come, and his story ties straight back to something I told you in the first minute. Which brings us last to the man who arrived at the same time as Ariadne Oliver and said less than anybody else in the series. David Yelland played George Poirot's valet from Series 10 onwards, and playing a valet is one of the most thankless assignments an actor can be handed. George exists to carry things into rooms and to be discreet. He has almost no story of his own. And Yelland turned him into somebody you actively look forward to seeing, purely through stillness and timing, and the sense of a man who knows exactly how much he is permitted to say, and says that much, and not one syllable more. He was born on the 30th of November 1947. He read English at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and then went straight into 3 years at the Glasgow Citizens Theatre, which in that period was one of the toughest and most exciting places in Britain to learn how to do this properly. That Glasgow apprenticeship is worth pausing on. The Citizens in those years was famous for putting on enormous, visually daring productions on almost no money in a working-class part of the city, with cheap seats so that anybody could get in. An actor who survives 3 years of that comes out able to hold a stage with nothing but his own stillness, which is more or less the job description for playing a valet who is not allowed to have opinions. He has been on your television for far longer than you realise. In 1974, he played the title role in the BBC's David Copperfield. He was Nicholas Rumpole in Rumpole of the Bailey for Thames. And in 1981, he appeared in Chariots of Fire in a part most people watch without ever registering the name behind it. He played the future Edward VIII, the Prince of Wales. Now think back to the very beginning of this video. David Suchet's grandfather, James Jarchet, was the Fleet Street photographer who took the first pictures of Edward VIII with Wallace Simpson. 6 decades later, the actor who had played that same king would be standing in a studio in a black tailcoat, handing David Suchet his hat. Nobody planned it. Nobody has ever made anything of it. But there it is, running quietly underneath a detective series, the way these things always seem to. At 78, Yelland is still a working stage actor of the old, properly trained sort. And what he leaves behind is the hardest thing in this business to teach: the confidence to do almost nothing in front of a camera and to trust that it will read. So that is where the 6 of them stand. The question I put to you at the start was what a person does with the rest of their life after a part like this one. And it turns out there are 6 different answers to it. Suchet went back to the stage, read the whole Bible aloud, and was knighted. Fraser writes thrillers about a contract killer and teaches Shakespeare to people a third of his age. Jackson went home to Nottinghamshire and did some of the best work of his life in his 70s. Moran reads the stars. Wanamaker, whose father was shut out of his own country, is now among the most decorated actors of this one. Yelland is still on a stage somewhere, saying very little, beautifully, and all 6 of them are still here. That is worth saying plainly, because on this channel it is very often not the case. We spend a great many of these videos telling you who we have lost. This time there is nobody to mourn, and I think that is rather wonderful. 6 people who work together on something careful and old-fashioned and unhurried, and every last one of them lived to see it become the version of those stories the whole world settled on. There is one other thing they have in common, and you may have spotted it as we went. Not one of them treated this as beneath them. A children's television theme, a bass guitar, a Cambridge English degree, 9 Olivier nominations, a knighthood. These were not people killing time until something better arrived. They were serious people who decided that a detective story on a Sunday evening was worth doing properly. That is why it lasted, and it is why you are still watching it 37 years later. It started with a middle-aged man in a garden with a penny between his knees, trying to walk like somebody who had only ever existed on a page. 37 years later, that walk is the first thing anybody pictures when they hear the name. It turns out you really can build something permanent out of 93 notes in a notebook and a flat refusal to do the job the easy way.